It remains to consider whether the book can be said to be utterly without social importance. We are mindful that there was expert testimony, much of which was strained, to the effect that Memoirs is a structural novel with literary merit, that the book displays a skill in characterization and a gift for comedy, that it plays a part in the history of the development of the English novel, and that it contains a moral, namely that sex with love is superior to sex in a brothel. But the fact that the testimony may indicate this book has some minimal literary value does not mean it is of any social importance. We do not interpret the social importance test as requiring that a book which appeals to prurient interest and is patently offensive must be unqualifiedly worthless before it can be deemed obscene. Hello, friends and enemies, and welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. Today, in honor of Garbaugust Vintage Week, we will be discussing one of the treasures of trash. Fanny Hill, or The Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, by John Cleland. Now, in the course of my studies of the literature of 18th century England, I heard a great deal about Fanny Hill, being considered a rather humorous and controversial smut novel of the time period, something that many of the leading lights of the age decided to weigh in on, none to great effect. But I never read it until I was intrigued, I was tempted by the Garbaugust Vintage Week theme. Now, Fanny Hill was first published in 1749, which I do believe qualifies it for the requirement that your Vintage Week books be published before 1980. Ollie, you'll have to let me know if I've gotten this right. It would be dreadfully embarrassing otherwise. So, let's start from the top. What is Fanny Hill? Well, at its most baseline level, Fanny Hill is a smut novel. It follows a very simple narrative scaffolding of a young girl going from the country to London, being sold into a brothel, and then being passed around as the kept mistress to a variety of different gentlemen. But what's interesting about it as a reader is that it often feels like it's three different books competing with one another. One of the modes of the writing is that of the 18th century sentimental novel. I'm talking Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, and a lot of other people that you probably haven't read unless you had a professor of English determined to make you suffer. The closest to you, an average person who doesn't hate themselves, has probably gotten to these authors is if you've seen the classic film version of Tom Jones. These were the kinds of novels that the great novelists of the 19th century, from Jane Austen in the early 19th century, all the way up to Charles Dickens in the mid to late, would have grown up reading. So they are considered by many to be the foundation of the modern novel, although the words modern and novel, as well as the word foundation, are hotly contested amongst literary critics. Anything to justify the existence of a paper. The second strain that really makes itself known in this novel is the sort of grotesque social satire that dominated a good deal of the print material of the time and place. Think, if you will, for a moment of my perennial nemesis, Alexander Pope, for a good example of this. Pope famously wrote a poem called The Lady's Dressing Room. in which an amorous young gentleman sneaks into his lady's dressing room in order to soak in the atmosphere of angelic perfection he thinks will have suffused the room from his love, only to discover that the process of putting on 18th century makeup is extremely disgusting, and that there is, in fact, a chamber pot in the room, and his lady is a human being with all the necessities that entails. Of course, the satirical angle of the poem, at least the intended one, on Pope's part, is to knock down the worship of an object of love, to undercut sentimentalism, and to take aristocratic women down a peg. Pope really hated women. There were a good deal of ironic responses to this. For example, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a hero of mine, wrote a response poem in which she depicted Pope as being offended by a prostitute and vowing to write the poem in revenge, to which the prostitute responds, "Send me a copy and I'll use it to wipe my ass." So that's the sort of thing we're talking about there. Social satire and wit that really revels in grotesquerie and toilet humor and even the horror of being in a physical body. Because if you think having to inhabit your assigned meat puppet is bad now, imagine what it was like before indoor plumbing and antibiotics. Imagine having to create a whole fashion around cutting out little bits of fabric to cover up smallpox scars, for instance. Or imagine a world full of people with complexions so bad that they would sometimes shellac their faces with layers of white lead that would give them a glowing porcelain complexion at the expense of having to continue to paint themselves with lead for the rest of their lives, lest the lead poisoning beneath be revealed. The subject matter of sex work was rife with the opportunities for this kind of social criticism. Something I think that, because of his many conflicting intentions, Cleland actually sort of drops the ball on. There's a lot more that could have been done there, and it honestly surprises me that a man of his station and education in the time period didn't do more with it. By the way, Cleland's station and education, firmly middle class. He worked for a long time as an agent of the East India Company in Bombay, which tells you all you need to know about the man's moral character. When he came home, he got embroiled in a financial con that ended with him in debtor's prison, whence he published Fanny Hill, which was an immediate runaway success and got him, less than a year after his release from prison, rearrested for obscenity. He disavowed the novel, and then immediately published a bowdlerized version, which continued to make him a good deal of money for the rest of his life, much to his chagrin. The third mode, I think, of this novel is as a sort of apologia, something that was often used in the title of memoirs. For example, An Apology for the Life of Colley Cibber, which I've talked about before on here because it's a delightful book. It was thought that telling one's life story required a certain rhetorical stance as explaining and acquitting oneself. Sort of mixture of neoclassical education and Christian shame that became a cultural touchstone. So, while the narrator, Fanny Hill herself, affects or perhaps even obtains a certain amount of shamelessness, there is a sense of an apologia for a man who uses sex workers in this book. A lot of tacit excuses are made for specifically the ways in which well-off men used poor women. Okay, well, I'm sure that you have more specific questions. What was the book actually like? Is it any good? Does it have redeeming qualities? How's the quality of the smut? All valid questions. Normally, in a review, it's considered tasteful to give a sort of compliment sandwich. They did this well, I criticize this, they did this well also. There just isn't that much to compliment about this book, though, so I'm going to go ahead and reverse that and do an insult sandwich. Okay, the first insult is really more of an indisputable observation, and that is that Cleland was definitely hashtag men writing women. He did not know how women work. Let's start by how he imagines a woman might describe herself. Imagine, if you will, describing yourself in this manner. The delicious austerity and hardness of my yet unripe budding breasts, the whiteness and firmness of my flesh, the freshness and regularity of my features, the harmony of my limbs, all seem to confirm him in his satisfaction with his bargain. I mean, maybe if you're describing your OC in a fanfic. Maybe. I won't belabor the point too much on Cleland's misunderstanding of women's anatomy, because some of it is honestly a little triggering, but let's just say he believes in the concept of virginity, already a mistake because it's fake. And even if it were real, it certainly wouldn't be physically observable. He goes to great lengths to describe the effect of a woman losing her virginity and whether and how certain women are able to fake virginity, that sort of thing. It's actually pretty gruesome at points. And the third point on Cleland not understanding how women work is a constant fixation from the narrator and other women in the story on how no sexual activity can possibly be satisfying to them unless a penis is involved. I'm just going to give you some choice passages on that matter. For my part, I now pined for more solid food, and promised tacitly to myself that I would not be put off much longer with this foolery of woman to woman. Yes, there's lesbian activity, but of course it's only in service of thinking about and preparing for men, and it's never about the women. It's very George R.R. Martin of him, you know. Or this gem. Man alone, I almost instinctively knew, as well as by what I had industriously picked up at weddings and christenings, was possessed of the only remedy that could reduce this rebellious disorder. This rebellious disorder, of course, being adolescent sexuality. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Okay, so in this insult sandwich, there will be a compliment filling, which is that occasionally the writing in this book is decent, and there are a few passages that are fine. I'll share a few, just to give you an idea. In this passage, Fanny is describing the friends she made at a brothel. The sameness of our sex, age, profession, and views soon created an unreserved freedom and intimacy as if we had been for years acquainted. They took and showed me the house, their respective apartments, which were furnished with every article of convenience and luxury, and above all a spacious drawing-room, where a select revelling band usually met in general parties of pleasure, the girls supping with their sparks and acting their wanton pranks with unbounded licentiousness, whilst a defiance of awe, modesty, or jealousy were their standing rules, by which, according to the principles of their society, whatever pleasure was lost on the side of sentiment was abundantly made up to the senses in the poignancy of variety and the charms of ease and luxury. The authors and supporters of this secret institution would, in the height of their humor, style themselves the restorers of the golden age, and its simplicity of pleasures, before their innocence became so unjustly branded with the names of guilt and shame. That honestly sounds like a nice friend group. Here she discusses a time when she was kept as mistress of a baronet, and decided to have sex with a poor, I think he was a footman. And she is defending her choice to throw over an aristocrat for a commoner, which I think is rather charming. Oh, but say you this was a young fellow of too low a rank of life to deserve so great a display. Maybe so, but was my condition strictly considered one jot more exalted, or had I really been so much above him? Did not his capacity of giving such exquisite pleasure sufficiently raise and ennoble him, to me at least? Let who would for me cherish, respect, and reward the painters, the statuaries, the musicians' art, in proportion to the delight taken in them. But at my age, and with my taste for pleasure, a taste strongly constitutional to me, the talent of pleasing, with which nature had endowed a handsome person, formed to me the greatest of all merits, compared to which the vulgar prejudices in favor of titles, dignities, honors, and the like held a very low rank indeed. Nor perhaps would the beauties of the body be so much affected to be held cheap, were they in their nature to be bought and delivered. But for me, whose natural philosophy all resided in the favorite center of sense, and who was ruled by its powerful instinct in taking pleasure by its right handle, I could scarce have made a choice more to my purpose. It's a little bit condescending to the young man, but I think that there is a sort of embedded philosophical argument that would have played well into the discourse of the time there. These, I assume, are the sorts of passages that were read aloud in court when, in the 1960s, this novel went on trial for obscenity in America. In fact, this book is the source of a Supreme Court decision, Memoirs versus Massachusetts, that is technically still very important for its essential decision that it's fine to write a porn book as long as it's got at least a paper-thin plot. You'll recall the passage I read at the beginning of this video. That was quoted from the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling against Fanny Hill in the case called A Book Named John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure et al. Versus Attorney General of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that the book was obscene, and the case was taken to the Supreme Court, where, in the majority opinion, Justice Brennan wrote, "The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts erred in holding that a book need not be unqualifiedly worthless before it can be deemed obscene. A book cannot be proscribed unless it is found to be utterly without redeeming social value. This is so, even though the book is found to possess the requisite prurient appeal and to be patently offensive." Thank you, Supreme Court, for making Garbaugust possible for us lowly Americans. Okay, this has been going a while, so let's just move forward and finish off this insult sandwich with a slice of fuck you bread for John Cleland. I'm going to try to minimize quotation in this section because what I'm talking about is Cleland's homophobia and his tendency to depict a lot of sexual assault, which I understand that we expect in trash books, but that doesn't make it pleasant to read. I already discussed how Cleland depicts lesbian sex as something that women would only possibly do if they were bored in the absence of a man. This is common enough for male writers throughout time. But it was particularly popular in the 18th century for male writers to take a female narrator and use her as the mouthpiece for that man's opinions, especially that man's opinions about what women thought and were for. Because, of course, it's the 18th century. Everything has to be for something. Get wrecked, Enlightenment. I'm coming for you. In regard to the homophobia that I want to discuss here, I want to talk about a particular section of the book where Fanny witnesses two men having sex with each other. This scene is met with absolute disgust, even from our not normally very susceptible narrator. And, well, first I want to share a little bit of how it's depicted, and then I want to really let you know the kicker from Cleland's own life. So discussing her reaction, Fanny says, "The criminal scene they acted, I had the patience to see to an end, purely that I might gather more facts and certainty against them, in my design to do their deserts instant justice, and accordingly, when they had readjusted themselves and were preparing to go out, burning as I was with rage and indignation, I jumped down from the chair in order to raise the house upon them." But don't worry, before she can actually go narc on them and get them imprisoned or possibly, lynched, she trips over something and they make it out alive. When she later discusses this with her madam and confidant Mrs. Cole goes on a screed about how English homosexuals are particularly disgusting, saying whatever effect this infamous passion had in other ages and other countries, it seemed a particular blessing on our air and climate that there was a plague spot visibly imprinted on all that are tainted with it. I'm not going to belabor the point by reading the entire passage, but you get the idea. In a novel that delights in the depiction of all kinds of sexual acts, including female homosexuality and several sexual assaults of women by men, there is no tolerance at all for male homosexuality. Especially fascinating, considering the fact that Cleland was almost certainly gay or bi, or at least a man who slept with other men himself. In fact, his friend, almost certainly a bitter ex-boyfriend, Thomas Cannon, wrote what some consider one of the first defenses of male homosexuality in English, although I wouldn't call it a defense of what we now consider homosexuality to be, given that it was titled Ancient and Modern Pederasty Investigated and Exemplified. That said, they were definitely bitter exes, and in fact, Cleland, shortly after this, accused Cannon of murder, so I guess that's one way to break up. I also don't want to belabor the point on the sexual assaults depicted in the book. Suffice it to say, they are many and varied. In one case, Fanny sees the man who is keeping her as a mistress assault a maid in the house, and she shows no concern at all for the maid, only a desire to take revenge against the both of them. And in one case, another sex worker of her acquaintance describes being assaulted in her sleep. That's not all of it. That's just what I'm willing to share. So, what does the reading of this book mean in the context of Garbaugust? Is it trash? That's the first question. And as I've shared, according to the United States Supreme Court, technically no. according to scholars of literature, it certainly has literary and historical value in that it contributed to and influenced several literary traditions. True enough. And according to ghouls throughout history who clamored for unauthorized bootlegged copies of this, in many cases, illegal book, well, it at the very least had acquisitive value. But is it trash? Yes. Of course it is. I mean, the pure nastiness and mean-spiritedness of this book qualify it as trash even if it's gratuitously sexual and occasionally violent content. And the low quality of the characterization of a woman by a man doesn't. It's trash. It's trashy, trash, or, to put it in 18th century terms, it's effluvia. That means shit. Thank you for your attention. Happy Garbaugust.